Despite all the chaos and despondency that we have, due to the Trump administration's reckless trade policies, there is an opportunity there as well for Canada, for Canadian unions, for Canadian industrial policy to find and, in fact, grow a niche in the clean energy economy by offering something that currently the U.S. can't, which is more stability and more predictability in its policy. I'm Todd Tucker. I direct industrial policy and trade research for Roosevelt Institute and Roosevelt Forward, where we work on progressive economics in the United States. Trump has gone through on-again, off-again tariffs that almost by the hour, if not the minute, are changing, which is the exact opposite of what you need for a stable industrial policy. There is no question that tariffs can perform an important component of a smart industrial strategy. And we saw this under Joe Biden's administration, which had a range of subsidies encouraging businesses to invest in the clean energy economy and working, importantly, with union labor and communities while they do it. And tariffs performed an important backstop to that subsidy. It sort of looked at especially the high excess capacity that was going on in China, where they were able to produce at a moment's notice many times what the world needed in terms of batteries or electric vehicles. And so Biden instituted a tariff, a strategic tariff, to help complement that domestic industrial strategy and make sure that we weren't overwhelmed by a flood of Chinese imports. What Trump has done is the exact opposite of that. He's putting tariffs on one minute, taking them off the next minute. And, what firms need in order to make multi-billion dollar investments in communities across America is certainty. And strategic tariffs can be a part of that as a floor to provide some long-term certainty. But the uncertainty and instability that we're seeing in Trump's decision-making right now is the very opposite of that. And we're seeing the negative consequences already in terms of projects being paused, in terms of shifts at auto companies being taken off and workers getting furloughed. That kind of chaos and uncertainty is the opposite of what we need for a stable long-term industrial policy. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act was an elaboration of an earlier idea that had come from progressive Democrats called the Green New Deal. And what the Green New Deal was an industrial policy for the clean energy economy paired with an industrial policy for the care economy and investing in service sector jobs. So recognizing that both service sector jobs and manufacturing jobs were important, they each have a role to play in both the US and Canada, where both of our economies are about 80% of the employment is in the service sector and a much lower number in the manufacturing sector. But they're both important and they both have a role to play. The Inflation Reduction Act, unfortunately, did not have the major investments in the care economy that Canada is already doing over the course of the last few years and providing for dental care, providing for greater health care. That's a comparative advantage that Canada has over the US because you were able to get some of those things done. But I think the part that we were able to get done in the US is the clean energy part of it. And we did some really innovative policy that I think is important as a model to show how labor, community, and industry can be brought together to pursue high road industrial practices. So in the Inflation Reduction Act, the core of it was something called the investment tax credit, which gave companies that were investing in clean energy industries a 6% subsidy towards their cost of capital if they were investing in a given technology that had promises for reducing emissions. But that tax subsidy got much more generous, went up to 30% if you were paying prevailing wages and working with labor unions as a part of your production method. It could go up even higher if you were investing in previously fossil fuel dependent communities, in low income communities, or you were using domestic supply chains for your production. And I think that shows that there's a way to create an industrial policy that's both flexible, so that each firms can kind of decide how to mix and match the policy that best meets their needs, while also sort of not having it just be a corporate handout, but it's actually a way to also bring labor and communities along with the industrial policy investments. So I think, had we seen a second Biden administration or had we seen a Harris administration where they were just continuing that policy, I think Canada would have benefited from it as well, right? That the sheer fiscal capacity of the U.S. government is such that if we're investing in a lot of our industry, Canadian industry is going to see a benefit on that in the back end as well. But I think now that Trump is really tearing up a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act and the policies that Biden had put in place, that's also an opportunity for Canada to take up the mantle, right? And think about ways that you could be using creative new forms of tax credits, of grants, of support for research and development to both kind of move up the technological frontier for Canada while also bringing Canadian workers and communities along. It's important to emphasize that we're in the middle of a very acute climate crisis that's going to get worse very rapidly. Had the U.S. and other countries addressed the climate crisis in the 1990s, we might have been able to resolve the problem with a modest carbon tax. By the time we got to the 2010s, the U.S. was trying to use a cap and trade system, but that was unable to get support from the Congress out of concerns that would raise cost for consumers and make U.S. industry less competitive. By the time the Biden administration came along and the Green New Deal idea was out there, the strategy had shifted away from carbon taxes and towards a green industrial policy. And the idea there is that you can help lower emissions while also keeping cost manageable for everyday consumers. That was a balance that was ultimately much more politically palatable than carbon taxes had been in the past or than cap and trade schemes had been in the past. Now that Trump is ripping up the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to be even back to the drawing board for, a fourth or fifth time, where some of the policies that we'd used, like sort of tax credits that were somewhat flexible, that allowed industry to kind of pick and choose what parts of the Inflation Reduction Act they wanted to take advantage of. In the future, we're going to have even quicker policies that are even more, I think, state-directed as a result. At the Roosevelt Institute, we've had scholars put out proposals of what we could do a few years from now to move at the speed and scale needed to address the climate crisis. All ideas are on the table. Ideas like a national development bank or a sovereign wealth fund. Ideas like direct publicly owned production of clean energy products. These are the kind of ideas that, right now might be seen as a little bit outside of the norm, but I think that given the more acute crisis that we're going to face over the next few years, some of these ideas that seem a little out there today will become more mainstream in the future. Well, so some of the parties around the world that are doing the most to be ambitious around clean energy industrial policy are sort of the Labour Party of Australia, Labour Party of the UK. In the US, obviously our system is different in that you sort of have, everybody from this point, from like Liz Cheney all the way to Bernie Sanders are kind of part of the same kind of Democratic Party coalition at the moment. And so, our dynamic is a little bit different. What we've seen just even the first few weeks since Trump came to office is that progressive Democrats are really leading the charge on both resisting Trump and imagining what comes after. So there are ideas now that Doge and Elon Musk are destroying the administrative state. We both have the obligation and the opportunity to rebuild the administrative state in the future in a way that puts workers and the environment at the center of all that we do. So progressives in the United States are not waiting. We are engaging. We are pushing back on the Trump administration and also planning for what comes next. One of the things that we're seeing is that for companies that want to invest in, say, the battery industry, one of the constraints that they face is, do they have enough workers with the right skills in the right places to be able to power that clean energy transition? And one of the concerns that we hear time and time again from project developers is that often communities don't have enough affordable housing to be able to bring in the workers that are needed to staff this kind of industrial renaissance. And so it's really important as we think about the next phase of industrial policy that we move beyond just kind of the tax credits for promoting the clean energy by lowering the cost of capital, but also that we're sort of thinking an all of the above approach that looks at regional development planning as well, where you get state and local governments involved in investing in housing and unblocking some of the constraints that keep housing from being built so that it's easier both for the workers and for the business owners to figure out how they're going to make sustainable industrial investments grow. And that's not just what happens within the four corners of the factory floor, but it's also what happens in the schools, in the neighborhoods, in the hospitals, that are going to be all of the complementary economic activities we'll need to make the clean energy investments really thrive and prosper over time. I'm really happy to be here at the Broadbent Institute, which of course is named after Ed Broadbent, who is, one of Canada's most interesting political economy thinkers in history. And, one of his main contributions, as I've learned over the years through engaging with Broadbent scholars, really is thinking about an independent national development strategy for Canada. This is something that makes a lot of sense, right? You don't, just as the US doesn't want to be totally dependent on China for its supply chains, it makes sense that Canada wouldn't want to be completely dependent on the US. I'd love to say that we're going to be a reliable partner now and into the future, but obviously current events are showing that that's not necessarily always a good bet. So I think it makes sense for every country to sort of be looking at its own resilience and thinking of how to balance these competing concerns of efficiency versus resilience, sort of short-term gain versus sort of long-term prosperity that I think every country needs to have as part of its national development strategy. I work at the Roosevelt Institute, which is dedicated to the historical memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was some would say greatest president. I would certainly say greatest president of all time, who, really addressed at his time the crisis of the Great Depression, which manifested itself in a couple of different ways. In some ways, the problem of the Great Depression were that prices were too high. The cost of living was high for people. They weren't making the wages that they needed to make ends meet. But in other instances, it was that the price was too low, that basically the price of farm products, the price of industrial products wasn't high enough that it needed to be in order to really share the gains of production with workers. FDR had to do two things simultaneously. He had to go after corporate price gouging and other forms of abuses that were keeping prices too high for people, while at the same time in other industrial activities, making sure that companies and workforces could earn a return on their investment. And so he was basically a combination of antitrust and anti-monopoly policy on the one hand and industrial policy on the other hand. And these kind of things went together as part of a comprehensive strategy. That type of comprehensive strategy is something that we need now. We're entering this economic transition where, due to Trump's tariff tantrums, there's the possibility that not only will tariffs go up, but that companies will take advantage of the chaos around the tariffs going up as a way to price gouge consumers more than would even be merited by the tariff increases. So we need to, both in the US and Canada, go after some of that price gouging and price pressures that have led to an affordability crisis that was already a big problem for communities across North America, while also doing that long-term planning and long-term investment to make sure that, clean energy is as profitable and as well remunerated for workers as fossil fuel production was in the past. And that's going to require an all-of-government approach to go after, on the one hand, high prices and price gouging, on the other hand, making those investments for the long-term future of our economies.